Welcome to a short screencast where I want to show basically how to use Camunda Cloud in order to orchestrate functions. And today, this is actually some code I developed for the AWS Community Summit in London. So I use AWS Lambdas for serverless functions. And yes, I use Zeebe in the Camunda Cloud in order to get going. Everything is on GitHub, so this is where you can find the code. And today I quickly want to walk you through. And the basic problem I want to solve, and I use a couple of slides from that talk here, is that I have three Lambdas to book a car, to book a hotel, so rental car, a hotel, and a flight. And I have to coordinate them, so basically put them in a sequence in order to book the whole trip. And the way I want to approach that today is basically I want to offer another Lambda, which can do the whole trip booking. And in order to implement like the coordination, I use, in this case, Camunda Cloud and Zeebe as a workflow engine in order to do that. And that means it calls a couple of other Lambdas basically in a sequence with a relatively easy workflow. That's what we will see live in a second. So that's just the intro that you know what I'm talking about. And architecturally, there are multiple options. The one I'm using today is I'm using Camunda Cloud, Zeebe within Camunda Cloud. And then I have my Lambdas. And basically what I use is I use the Node.js Zeebe client in a Lambda in order to kick off new workflow instances, right? So I will have that Lambda starting new workflow instances. And then when the workflow, basically the service task, want to call other Lambda functions, what they do is they just use the HTTP invocation. So basically this goes via API gateway, and it's a simple HTTP invocation of these Lambdas. And that's more or less it, right? The alternative, which I don't show today, but the conceptual alternative would be, if you don't want to expose your Lambdas via API gateways, to have some own component within your AWS account, some whatever container that subscribes to Zeebe and gets all the work, all the tasks for Lambda invocations, and then does that natively and basically lets Zeebe know and so on and so forth. There are a couple of trade-offs, but I don't want to discuss that today. So this is what we will do. So let's get going. I mean, that's the code is here. We basically just follow the README. What we have to do, the first thing, we have to create a cluster in Camunda Cloud. So, okay, you probably have to sign up for Camunda Cloud first. I already did that. So what I can do is I create a new cluster, which I call Lambda Fun. So this takes up to a minute to be fully provisioned, but we don't have to wait for that now. I get a couple of coordinates of that cluster. What I can do as well, I can create client credentials. So that's basically, it's my Lambda calling, but I could be any client for now, so I don't care too much about security. So I use these credentials for everything. So I now have basically everything I need here already prepared. The next thing, typically what you want to do is you want to deploy your workflow definition, the model of how I work, to Zeebe. I want to do that a bit later to give the cluster time to come up. So what I do first, deploy my functions. Okay, so if you go here, it basically goes to the functions folder of the same GitHub repo. And there are all the Lambdas you need. That's simple Lambdas with Node.js code, which doesn't do much, to be honest. So that's relatively straightforward. And I use the serverless framework here to deploy them basically on my AWS account. And what I do is I bind all them to the API gateway in order to be able to call them. I make them private, which means I need to have an API key in this case to access them, which will also be created, right? And then for the car booking, I have a put function. For the cancellation, I have the same URL with the delete method. Okay, that's more or less it. Let's give that a go. If I go here, I can just say serverless deploy. What it does, it packages all these functions into a zip file, uploads that to S3, and then provisions everything I need and basically in the background. That will take a bit, not very long, but a bit, and we will not wait for that. In the meanwhile, we can look back to our cluster, which is healthy. So that means now the whole Zeebe engine is up and running. We get the operational UI up and running. So everything is ready on the workflow engine side. So what we can do is we can now deploy our workflow. So if we go back here, you see there's a .bpmn file. .bpmn means that's our workflow. If I open that, it's not a big surprise. So I want to do like hotel booking, rental car, flight. If you look at the service tasks, you see that they use the Camunda HTTP worker. So I just invoke HTTP and I configure it via these headers. The intuitive thing is I need an URL. That's the URL I want to call, the HTTP URL. What you can see is that I use certain variables, and I show you how to set them in a minute. In order to get the proper URL, I set the method like put and this header, the API key we just talked about, in order to make it secure, right? I showed that in a minute, and the other function invocations are more or less the same. You just see that I call other functions here, and if I cancel, I just use delete method instead of the put method, right? What the HTTP connector does, it also copies the response of that HTTP call into the data of the workflow. So in this case, I get back a success variable basically, and I can use that in order to see if the booking was successful, then I go that way. If it wasn't successful, then I go that way, right? So that's more or less it. For that workflow, let's deploy that. If you go back here, hang on, I go back to the Zeebe folder. You see that deploying the workflow uses the Zeebe command line tool, which you can easily install. In that command line tool, you have to set a couple of things, which we get from the Cloud Console, like the cluster ID. Right, this is used actually to form the URL and the address of the cluster. So we have that to set that. We have to set the client ID here and the client secret. It's not a secret anymore now. You set that here. Right, and up to here, that's basically just to configure it to connect to the right Zeebe instance in Camunda Cloud and authenticate and these kind of things. So let's go there. Just open another prompt. So what I could do, for example, I could directly say, hey, give me the status of the current cluster. So it now talks to Zeebe and says, hey, we have one broker. I use the development mode, so no real clustering, one broker with 2 partitions. So it's not very surprising. What I can do is now I can deploy my workflow. So I go to the right folder, use CBCTL again, and not status, but say deploy, and then it's my trip booking BPMN. So I deployed, I get back a response that is what deployed as version 1 successfully. I can also see that if I go back, that was the wrong browser. If I go back to operate, do a refresh here, then you will see that this workflow was just deployed, trip booking, but no instances yet. So nothing is going on, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, we haven't yet started it, right? So that's good. Now, if we go back to our functions deployment, which succeeded in the meanwhile, what you can see is that you get the API key and you get the real endpoints you can use in order to call these functions via HTTP. And these are basically the variables we need to set in order to form the right URL here and use the API key. And as this is very environment specific, I don't want to hard code that in the workflow. That doesn't make any sense. And this is why I can set these variables like AWS API key Here, the Cloud Console for that Zeebe broker, for that HTTP worker here. So we say if you see something like AWS API key, replace it with this value. And then we have the second thing, like if you see something like the Lambda base URL, let's go here, then replace it with this, right? And this will be done in the background, so we don't have to do anything to make that work. So we deployed our workflow, we made sure the right variables are set in order to be able to call the Lambda. So the workflow should be already fully functional and the Lambdas are there. That's pretty good. The next thing we have to do is we have to provide the trip booking function in order to kick off new instances. And if we go to the README, it basically says the same thing. One additional hint, like also that Lambda has to authenticate against Zeebe. So if we go back here, if we go to Zeebe, there's the trip booking Lambda. And if you look at that, what you can see is that also this gets a couple of credentials we have to adjust. So if we go back to the Cloud Console, we see again client ID. That's the client ID, client secret. That's the client secret. And the cluster ID is this one. So that's all we have to do here. In my case, I use Node.js. So I use the Node.js client to talk to Zeebe. I mean, you could do whatever you want. I mean, it could be Java, it could be Go, it could be, yeah, whatever you want it to be. It actually doesn't matter. But for Lambdas, I think Node.js is a relatively straightforward choice. What this function does, it basically connects to Zeebe and then it just creates a workflow instance and hands over the data it just got internally. That's more or less it. So let's deploy that as well. Did I save it? Yes, I did. So what we can do is we can go to Zeebe and same thing, serverless deploy. Just do that. And if we, for example, look at the Amazon console, we see that the Lambdas, our hotel, car booking, and so on and so forth, are already deployed. And as soon as this is successful, we should also see that trip booking function being deployed. And as soon as that's the case, and we also get a URL for that, and with that URL, we can use basically a small curl thing here in order to call it. I mean, and I'm using Ubuntu here. Let's go to the Zeebe folder. I can't yet do it because it's not yet deployed, so we have to wait also for the right endpoint. In the meanwhile, let me show you something. I basically, as payload, I send over a JSON file, which we can have a quick look at. So, by the way, of course, these like Zeebe credentials, you shouldn't hardcode them in your JavaScript file. You should set them by environment as well, which is relatively straightforward, but it was too lazy to do. So I basically had the decision if I record this now or fix the environment variables, and I decided to do the recording. So I hope you agree with me on that being a good decision. So this is the request we sent over. We just have a couple of variables in the request. And if you look at the functions, like for example, the flight booking functions, it basically it reads the input data again, and then it looks for these attributes to be set. And if they are true, if they are set and if they're set to true, then we simulate a failure and basically respond with non-success, otherwise we respond with success. So that's the whole business logic I have in the background. As you can see, that's really straightforward. So at the moment, we're still waiting for AWS to deploy our function. This gives me an opportunity to explain you one more thing, which is also a bit of the reason why this takes longer than the other function probably. So what I had to do in order to use the Zeebe Node.js client within the Lambda is you also have to provide libraries which are packaged together with your Lambda. And in my case, this is here. So I have a package station where I basically depend on a certain Zeebe Node client. Then you basically just do the npm magic in order to download everything, and that gets packaged in the same zip and uploaded to Amazon. And in this case, that's a bit bigger than earlier on. There's one tricky thing. It took me a moment at least to figure it out, as we are using gRPC, and gRPC as a communication mechanism underneath uses really platform-dependent native libraries. It basically, when I do npm install, it installs for me, as I'm on Windows, the Windows thing, which is not what I need in order to deploy it on Amazon, because there we run on a Linux machine. You have to do a bit of magic to get the right native library and package that as part of it. But you find an example here. In the meanwhile, we're done. So we now deployed the trip booking coordinator function. This is the URL, so we can give that a go. Okay, that was not clever. I just want to make sure I don't have any typos in here. So that's the whole URL I put with the request I just said. It gives me back a trip booking started. That looks good. So let's quickly go to operate. So if I refresh here, what we can see is that we now have one instance currently in the making. If I go back, now it's finished. So I was at the very moment when it's just walking through it. So this instance, what you can see, it just booked the hotel, it booked the car, it booked the flight, but then it canceled the flight, and then it canceled the car, canceled the hotel. Why is that? If you look at the variables, you see that we have book flight failure set to true in the input we set, and this basically let it go this way. If I go back and say, hey, everything is up and running normal, and I send in another request, go back to operate, go back to see everything. Hang on, should refresh. Then you see, okay, there's a new instance just started. If I go to that instance, you see it basically just book hotel, book car, book flight, trip booked. So it didn't compensate for anything. Yeah, that's more or less it. I mean, I could prove that the lambdas were called. I'm not sure if you're really too interested in that. Let's do it just for one. So if I go to book hotel, I can see on the monitoring tab, for example, that this was like, let's say we go for 1 minute. There we see our one invocation. Hey, awesome. Yeah, that's more or less all I have for today. So that's kind of the round trip. I created a cluster. I deployed the workflow to it, using a couple of variables in order to call the right lambdas. Then I provisioned a function which I then could call, which triggers the workflow and then calls again, orchestrates the other functions. So far, so fun. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was interesting. See you next time. Bye-bye.